Have you ever felt the world shift under your feet, just as you thought you finally found solid ground? That's how it began for the Carter family. On a bright morning in 1968, the air was thick with hope and the promise of something new. James Carter, his wife Lillian, and their little boy Marcus, all dressed in their Sunday best, stood on the sidewalk in front of a small, white house with blue shutters, their first home. Years of saving, scraping, and dreaming had led them to this moment. The moving truck idled at the curb, boxes stacked high, the future packed up and ready to be unwrapped. Lillian squeezed James's hand, her eyes shining with pride and nerves. Marcus clutched a battered teddy bear, his face pressed to the car window, staring at the house that was supposed to be his castle. Before I go any further, I want to welcome you to Injustice Browin. My name is Mark Joie, and if you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is part of this story, too. James stepped up to the porch, the key heavy in his palm. He'd worked 2 jobs for this nights at the factory, weekends at the garage. Lillian had taken in laundry, pinched every penny, and prayed over every bill. They'd done everything right. They'd followed every rule. And now, finally, they were here. The American dream, right? That's what they'd been told. That's what they believed. But as James reached for the door, a car pulled up fast. A white man in a crisp shirt and tie, Mr. Harlan, the real estate agent, jumped out, waving his arms. Behind him, a neighbor stood on her porch, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. James felt the first chill of something wrong, but he tried to smile. "Morning, Mr. Harlan. We're just about to move in." Mr. Harlan didn't smile back. He looked past James, at Lillian and Marcus, then back at the house. "James, I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake. The paperwork, there's a problem. You can't move in today." Lillian's face fell. "What do you mean, a mistake? We signed everything. We paid." The neighbor's voice cut through the morning. "This is a quiet street. We like to keep it that way." James felt his heart pounding. He looked at the key in his hand, then at his son, who was watching with wide, confused eyes. "We did everything you asked. We have the deed. We have the key." Mr. Harlan shifted, avoiding James's gaze. "I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do. You'll have to leave." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Lillian's hand shook. Marcus pressed closer to her, his small fingers gripping her skirt. The moving men looked away, suddenly busy with their own business. The neighbor didn't move. She just stared, daring them to argue, daring them to fight. James tried to reason, tried to plead, but every word bounced off a wall he couldn't see. The rules had changed, just like that. The dream was gone, snatched away by peoplehood. "Never know what it cost to get this far." Lillian's voice broke as she whispered, "Please, we have nowhere else to go." But Mr. Harlan just shook his head. "I'm sorry, I really am, but you can't stay." The Carters stood on the porch, surrounded by boxes and broken promises. The sun was still shining, but it felt cold now. Neighbors peeked through curtains, watching, judging, whispering. James felt the weight of every eye, every silent accusation. He wanted to scream, to fight, to demand justice, but he had his family to protect. He had to be strong. He turned to Lillian, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll find another way. I promise." But even as he said it, he knew something had changed. Something inside him, something inside all of them. Marcus tugged at his sleeve, his voice small and scared. "Why don't they want us here, Daddy?" James knelt down, pulling his son close. He didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense to a child, not one that would make sense to anyone who still believed in fairness. He just held Marcus tight, the key digging into his palm, useless now. The door in front of them stayed closed, and the world felt smaller, colder, and far less kind. That's how it starts, sometimes, not with a shout, but with a door quietly slammed in your face, and a question that lingers, echoing in the silence. Why? Why us? Why now? Why does hope always seem to cost so much more for some than for others? The Carters never planned to end up in a place like this. The apartment was small, the paint peeling, the pipes groaning at night. The windows rattled in the wind, and the heat barely worked. The neighborhood was boxed in by invisible lines drawn by banks, by landlords, by people who decided who belonged and who didn't. Red lines on a map, as real as any wall. The Carters had no choice. They took what they could get, what they were allowed. The dream of a house with blue shutters faded into the background, replaced by the daily struggle to make this new place feel like home. James left early every morning, his shoulders hunched, his eyes tired. He lost his job at the factory. After the move, they said they were downsizing, but he knew the truth. He'd seen the way the foreman looked at him, the way his name was always last on the list. Now he worked odd jobs fixing cars, hauling trash, anything to keep food on the table, every day. He swallowed his pride and kept going, but the world didn't make it easy. He'd show up for interviews, dressed in his best shirt, only to be told the position was filled. Sometimes he'd see a white man walk in after him and get the job on the spot. He'd stand outside, fists clenched, anger burning in his chest, but he couldn't let it show. Not here, not now. Lillian tried to keep the apartment clean, tried to make it feel safe. She hung curtains, scrubbed the floors, cooked what she could with what little they had, but even the grocery store was a battlefield. The manager followed her down the aisles, eyes sharp, waiting for her to slip up. Other shoppers whispered, clutched their purses, made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. One afternoon, a woman accused her of stealing. Lillian stood her ground, voice shaking but steady, and emptied her bag right there in front of everyone. Nothing but bread, milk, and a few bruised apples. The manager didn't apologize. He just turned away, leaving her to gather her things and her dignity. Marcus felt it too, in ways he couldn't always name. The other kids at school called him names, shoved him in the hallway, laughed when he tried to answer questions in class. The teachers looked the other way, or worse, blamed him for causing trouble. He came home with bruises, with stories he tried to hide, but Lillian saw the pain in his eyes. The way he flinched when someone knocked at the door. She held him close, whispered that he was smart, that he was good, that none of this was his fault. But Marcus wondered. He wondered why the world seemed so set against them, why nothing ever seemed to change. At night, the family sat together in the cramped living room, the TV flickering in the corner. James tried to make them laugh, told stories about when he was a boy, about the house they almost had. Lillian smiled, but her eyes were tired. Marcus listened, soaking up every word, every lesson. He saw the way his father's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. He heard the quiet arguments behind closed doors, the worry in his mother's voice. He felt the weight of it all, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Still, the Carters held on. They found small joys, a good meal, a warm hug, a moment of peace. They leaned on each other because that's all they had. The world outside was cold, but inside, they tried to keep the light burning. James did his best to shield Marcus from the worst of it, but kids see more than we think. Marcus saw the way his father's shoulders sagged, the way his mother's smile faded. When she thought no one was watching, he saw the fear, the anger, the helplessness. But he also saw something else, a stubborn kind of hope, a refusal to give in. One night, after a particularly hard day, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, tears in his eyes. James came in, sat beside him, and put a hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard, son. I know it don't seem fair, but we don't give up. Not ever. You hear me?" Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes. He didn't have the words, but he felt the truth of it. The world might try to break them, but the Carters would not be broken. Not now. Not ever. It started with the smell of smoke, sharp and bitter, curling through the thin walls in the middle of the night. Marcus woke first, coughing, his heart pounding in his chest. He shook his parents awake, panic rising in his voice. James was on his feet in an instant, grabbing shoes, yelling for everyone to get out. Lillian scooped up what she could, her purse, a family photo, the old key that had never opened their dream house. They rushed into the hallway, the air thick and choking, neighbors pouring out of their apartments in confusion and fear. The fire was in the building next door, flames licking up the side, windows shattering in the heat. People screamed, some still trapped inside, others banging on doors, desperate to help. James ran to the street, waving his arms, shouting for someone to call the fire department. But the sirens didn't come, not right away, not like they should have. Minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. The fire grew, hungry and wild, threatening to leap to their own building. Lillian held Marcus close, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the chaos. When the fire trucks finally arrived, the flames had already done their worst. The firefighters moved slow, almost careless. Barking orders, but ignoring the people who needed help, the police showed up next, not to comfort, but to question. They pulled aside the black residents, demanded to know who started it, who was responsible, as if fire was their fault. James tried to explain, tried to point out the families who needed help, but the officers barely listened. One of them shoved him back, told him to stay out of the way. Lillian's anger flared, hot and sharp. She saw the way the white neighbors were treated, offered blankets, spoken to gently while her own people were left shivering in the street. Accused before anyone even knew the truth. Marcus watched it all, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He was old enough now to see the pattern, to understand that this wasn't just bad luck. It was something deeper, something rotten at the core. He saw the fear in his mother's eyes, the frustration in his father's voice. He saw the way the police looked at them, not as victims, but as suspects, and something inside him snapped. He started asking questions, not just to his parents, but to anyone who would listen. Why did the fire department take so long? Why did the police treat them like criminals? Why did nobody care until it was too late? Lillian refused to let the night end in silence. She gathered the neighbors, her voice steady and strong, and demanded answers. She marched to the landlord's office, to the city council, to anyone who would listen. She wrote letters, made phone calls, organized meetings in the church basement. She refused to let their pain be ignored. The other tenants followed her lead, their anger turning into action. They demanded better fire safety, better treatment, respect. They refused to be invisible any longer. Marcus watched his mother, saw the fire in her eyes, and something shifted inside him. He started reading about the law, about rights and justice. He borrowed books from the library, stayed up late studying court cases and civil rights leaders. He dreamed of standing in a courtroom, of speaking truth to power, of making sure no one else had to feel this helpless, this small. The world had tried to silence them, but Marcus was learning how to speak. That night, after the flames died down and the last of the smoke drifted away, the Carters stood together in the street. Their apartment was still standing, but the scars would linger. Neighbors huddled close, some crying, some angry. All of them changed. James put his arm around Lillian, pulled Marcus close. They watched the fire trucks pack up, the police drive away. The city returned to its usual indifference, but something was different now. The Carters weren't alone. Their voices had joined with others, their pain turned into purpose. As the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, Marcus looked at his parents, at the neighbors gathered around them, and felt a new kind of hope. They had survived the fire. They had survived the suspicion, the neglect, the injustice, and they would not be silent. Not anymore. The world might try to burn them out, to push them aside, but the Carters stood firm, side by side, watching the smoke rise, refusing to disappear. Time has a way of changing everything. But some things, some wounds, some hopes never really fade. Years slipped by, and the city changed around the Carters. The old apartment building, once battered and forgotten, now stood in the shadow of new condos and coffee shops. The faces on the street changed, too, where there used to be neighbors who knew each other's names. There were now strangers with expensive shoes and hurried steps. The world called it progress. The Carters knew better. They saw what was happening. Rents rising, families pushed out, history erased one lease at a time, but the Carters were still there. James's hair had gone gray, his back a little more bent, but his spirit was unbroken. Lillian's hands were still strong, her voice still steady, though the years had carved new lines into her face. And Marcus had become the man his parents always hoped he'd be. He left for college, the first in his family, carrying their dreams with him. He studied late into the night, fueled by memories of injustice and the fire that nearly took everything. He learned the law, not just the words, but the power behind them. He learned how to fight with his mind, how to stand up in a courtroom and make people listen. When Marcus came home, he saw the changes with new eyes. The corner store where he used to buy candy was gone, replaced by a boutique. The playground where he'd scraped his knees was now a parking lot. But the old apartment building still stood, stubborn and proud, filled with families who refused to leave. His parents welcomed him back with open arms, pride shining in their eyes. But there was worry, too. The landlord had started sending letters, threats, disguised as notices, warnings about renovations and market rates. People were scared. Some had already left, unable to fight anymore. One evening, as the sun set over the city, James handed Marcus the old key. The same key he'd held on that porch so many years ago, the day their dream was stolen. It was worn, smooth now, the metal dulled by time and touch. I kept it, James said quietly. Didn't know why. Not really, but I couldn't let it go. Marcus turned the key over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the history, the pain, the hope. It wasn't just a key anymore. It was a promise, a reminder of what they'd lost and what they still had to fight for. Marcus didn't hesitate. He started meeting with tenants, listening to their stories, gathering evidence. The landlord was trying to force people out, raising rents, cutting off heat, ignoring repairs. It was illegal, but the law only worked if someone was willing to stand up and use it. Marcus filed a lawsuit, his name on the papers, his reputation on the line. He knew the risks. He knew the landlord had money, connections, lawyers of his own. But Marcus had something stronger. He had the truth. He had his family. He had the key. The case dragged on for months. There were nights when Marcus wondered if he'd made a mistake, if he was asking too much of people who'd already lost so much. But every time, he felt doubt creeping in. He thought of his parents, of James's quiet strength, of Lillian's unbreakable will. He thought of the neighbors who'd stood in the street after the fire, refusing to be silent. He thought of the key and what it meant. The community rallied around him. People who'd never spoken up before found their voices. They packed the courtroom, told their stories, refused to be intimidated. Marcus stood before the judge, his heart pounding, and spoke for all of them. He spoke of home, of dignity, of the right to belong. He spoke of the past and the future, and the promise that no one should be forced out of their home because of greed or prejudice. Through it all, the key stayed in his pocket, a small, cold reminder of everything at stake. It wasn't just about one building or one family. It was about all the doors that had been slammed shut, all the dreams that had been stolen, all the people who'd been told they didn't belong. Marcus was determined to change that, one case at a time, one key at a time. And as the trial drew to a close, hope began to grow, not just for the Carters, but for everyone who'd ever been told no when all they wanted was a place to call home. The day the verdict came down, the city felt different. The courthouse steps were crowded with neighbors, friends, and strangers who'd come to see if justice could finally find its way to their corner of the world. Marcus stood in the front row, his parents on either side, his hands trembling just a little. The judge's words echoed through the room, clear, final, impossible to ignore. The tenants had won. The landlord's tactics were illegal. The families could stay. The building would be repaired. Rents would be fair, and no one would be forced out of their home for a moment. No one moved. Then the room erupted. Cheers, tears, hugs from people who'd spent too many nights afraid of losing everything. Lillian wept openly, her hands covering her face, while James just closed his eyes and let out a breath he'd been holding for years. Marcus felt the weight of the old key in his pocket, heavier than ever, but now it felt like something else, a symbol of what they'd reclaimed, not just what they'd lost. Back at the apartment, the mood was electric. The building, once tired and neglected, was alive with laughter and music. Neighbors brought food. Children ran in the halls, and for the first time in a long time, the Carters' home felt safe. The repairs had already begun, fresh paint on the walls, new locks on the doors, heat that worked even on the coldest nights. The old fears hadn't vanished, but they'd been pushed back, replaced by something stronger. James sat in his favorite chair, the one he carried from place to place all these years, and watched his family gather round. Lillian moved through the room, her smile wide and real, her voice ringing out as she called everyone to the table. Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the city he'd once wanted to escape, and felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. He'd fought for this. They all had died in the middle of the celebration. James called for his grandson, Elijah. The boy was young, full of questions and energy, his eyes bright with curiosity. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the old key, the metal worn smooth by decades of hope and heartbreak. He pressed it into Elijah's hand, closing the boy's fingers around it. Elijah looked up, puzzled. "Grandpa, what's this for?" James smiled, his eyes shining. "That's the key to our home. It's been with us a long time, longer than you've been alive. It's seen a lot good and bad, but it's always meant the same thing. It means we belong." Elijah turned the key over, studying it. Does this mean we belong here now? James's voice was gentle, but strong. We always did. They just couldn't see it. But we knew. We never stopped knowing.